Chicago has become the epicenter in the struggle for community control of the police. In Chicago, we have legislation pending in the City Council trying to get an ordinance passed that will create an all-elected, all-civilian police accountability council. Now, we're organizing this from the bottom up, not from the top down. So we're going into the communities every weekend, and we're speaking to the people, and we're mobilizing the people to put pressure on their respective aldermen to get them off their rusty duskies so we can get this bill passed. That's the only way it's going to happen. It's not going to happen with the mayor endorsing it. It's not going to happen with the members of the city council just automatically coming in and saying this is the right thing to do. This has got to be the result of democratic mass pressure put by the masses of the people of this city on the city council, the powers that be, and the mayor to get this legislation passed. So what you've seen us doing out here this weekend is what we've been doing every weekend for the last 5 years. We started out with 150 supporters in the community. Now we have close to 50,000. So we've been making progress. And we're going to keep on fighting like this here until we get this bill passed. All power to the people.
Hi, everyone. My name is Skylar with Chicago Democratic Socialists of America, aka CDSA. And I want to start off by thanking you all so much for joining us today. As you just saw, we wanted to kick things off with a video from Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, also known as CARPR, given that CDSA's work on the Civilian Police Accountability Council is being done in service and support of CARPR's organizing. Later in this presentation, we'll be speaking in more detail about CARPR's work, as well as hearing directly from CARPR co-chair Jasmine Salas. I'll begin with a short introduction to the Civilian Police Accountability Council, or CPAC, and what political commitments lead CDSA to support it. Then we'll be moving on to current Chicago Police Department accountability, or lack thereof, and then get into more specifics about CPAC legislation and its provisions. Finally, we'll facilitate a discussion with Jasmine, as well as Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who is a co-sponsor of the CPAC ordinance and a member of the Progressive Reform Caucus of the Chicago City Council. This moment of struggle, sadness, and anger is an opportune time for us all to put pressure on the city around CPAC. We need to harness the rage and pain we are all feeling right now to support Black-led organizations like CARPR in creating real and lasting change for our communities. So thank you all again for taking time to hear from us today. One quick note before we get started. We will be posting a link in the chat with steps you can take to support this campaign at multiple points during the webinar, so please check that at your convenience. CPAC is an ordinance currently in City Council that seeks to establish community control of the Chicago Police Department and grants critical decision-making powers to a democratically elected body of civilians. As we saw in the video, CPAC's mission has been developed through conversations in Black communities and through work with and by survivors and families of torture victims at the hands of CPD. Notably, CPAC's powers would include overseeing investigations of misconduct and making disciplinary decisions when misconduct occurs, as well as involvement with budget and contract negotiations. A little bit more on this later. Nothing like CPAC currently exists in any US city, and its passage here would make Chicago the tip of the spear for radically democratic control of the police across the country. CPAC is made up of one qualified elected representative from every 2 contiguous police districts. Critically, a member of CPAC may not be a current or former law enforcement officer or a current or former employee of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. And lastly, a member of CPAC must have 2 or more years experience or expertise in civil rights, either representation, organizing, or activism on behalf of vulnerable communities. Now a little bit on the political commitments that lead CDSA to support CPAC. The fight for community control of the police is not a new one and ties back to work done by the Black Panthers throughout the country in the late 60s and 70s. Notably, they were able to get a similar ordinance on the ballot in Berkeley, California in 1971. And here in Chicago, Black Panther Chairman Fred Hampton had a community supervision of police program before he was murdered by CPD. CDSA is committed to supporting this legacy via our fight for CPAC. CPAC represents the most democratic way for residents of Chicago, especially those from communities that suffer most at the hands of police, to control who polices them and how they do it. Obviously, one of the core tenets of democratic socialism is democratizing the economy, utilities, etc. CPAC represents another opportunity for us to fight for the power to democratically elect our community leaders. In the tradition of the Black Panthers, this is a fight for self-determination for Black communities and communities of color. It's also important to note that this campaign has among its leaders people who themselves are survivors of police brutality and false imprisonment. For example, Mark Clemens, who was a victim of torture and false imprisonment, now works as a prison liaison and coordinator and sits on the board at Carper. Lastly, CPAC is not at odds with efforts around defunding and steps to abolition. Rather, CPAC is a mechanism to make these changes. We will be discussing this distinction in more detail with Jasmine and Carlos later in our webinar. While we are lucky enough to have Jasmine joining us to speak on behalf of Carper, I wanted to provide a brief introduction to their organization and its background. Carper has been in this fight since the 70s and has specifically been organizing for CPAC for the last 7 years or so. They have successfully campaigned for the release of tortured and wrongfully convicted Chicagoans, specifically those brutalized at the hands of Detective John Burge. We want to emphasize that this is a coalition campaign led by Carper, and CDSA does not and will not set the strategy or vision, but rather will work in a supporting role to Carper moving forward. Lastly, I want to share a non-exhaustive list of organizations in addition to Carper who have expressed support for CPAC. Now I'm going to pass it over to Tamer to discuss the current lack of accountability in Chicago policing.
Thank you very much, Skylar. My name is Tamer Abuzaid, and I'm a member of Carper and of CDSA. It's one thing to remember about civilian oversight is that it's not something new. This started in 1974 in Chicago with our first attempt by creating the Office of Professional Standards. This office was housed within the Chicago Police Department and did not do very well. Lori Lightfoot, our current mayor, was the chief administrator of OPS from 2002 to 2004. And if you look at the chart on the right side, you can see that during that tenure, out of over 10,000 cases that were submitted by complainants, only 19 of them were meaningfully sustained. That's 0.002. Obviously, OPS did not work, and they decided to make a change. The change came in the form of IPRA. IPRA was in existence from 2007 to 2017. During that time, policing did not change for Black and Brown communities. As you can see in these charts on the right, 74% of people killed or injured by officer-involved shootings were Black, and the percentages were similar for taser discharges. In fact, at the DOJ report, the report mentioned that Chicago's deficient accountability systems contributed to CPD's pattern or practice of unconstitutional conduct. So IPRA did not work, and they decided to make another change. Then came COPA. These here are the current players in the accountability system in Chicago. COPA, the Chicago Police Department, the FOP, which is the police union, and we use the word union loosely, the Chicago Police Board, you can see a picture there, and once again, our current mayor, Lori Lightfoot, was head of the police board for some time. And now we can look at how these agencies interact together. As you can see in this chart, there's a lot of complexity, and that's fine because it's a complicated issue. COPA investigates some misconduct while CPD investigates other types of misconduct, and they both make discipline recommendations to the superintendent. The police board hears disagreements between COPA and CPD and decides on discipline for officers. The FOP, their job is basically to negotiate contracts that make it harder to hold police accountable. And then you have arbitration and courts, and they hear appeals of discipline from police officers. So what do most of these have in common? They all come under the power of the mayor. Right now, the mayor holds all the power. The mayor appoints the superintendent of police, appoints the police board, appoints the chief administrator of COPA, and negotiates the contract with FOP. And even though we've tried sometimes giving city agencies the power to do other things, they don't take advantage of it. For example, that same DOJ report said, and quote, as confirmed by several police board officials, the board has never really fulfilled its duty of adopting CPD rules and regulations. It had the power, it just never used it. COPA has the power to recommend policy. It also seldom, if ever, uses it. What do you end up with when you have everybody only answer to the mayor? You end up with a system that is too far removed from the community to be accountable to it. And that is where CPAC comes in, putting the power in the hands of the people, enacting community control of the police. And now I'll hand it over to Michael, who will talk about some of the specific CPAC highlights and provisions. Michael?
Thank you very much, Tamer. Hi, I'm Michael with Chicago DSA, and I'm going to be speaking about some of the very exciting highlights in CPAC's powers today. Now, the main difference between CPAC and other accountability systems that exist, including our current one in Chicago, is power, where that power lies. So like Tamer was just saying, it is the power that it lies with the mayor and CPD itself, and they hold all the power in the system currently. CARPER and its allies, including us, DSA, and other organizations, want to transition these powers to a democratically elected council, the Civilian Police Accountability Council, CPAC. Yeah, so let's just jump right into the specifics about what these powers are. CPAC allows us to get the right people in the right positions of power. So CPAC will be able to appoint the superintendent of police, appoint the police board, and appoint the chief administrator of COPA. The CPAC ordinance will move those powers from the mayor to us. Another very important suite of powers that CPAC will have is the final review power for CPD policies and orders. And a very important specific example of those policies and orders is the rules and instructions around when use of force is applied. So you can see the profound effect that democratic control over the policy of when CPD can apply force, how that could affect lives and save lives and reduce the violence of CPD. CPAC will also be able to adopt rules and regulations for CPD, review the CPD budget and send to City Council for approval. So we'll have a say in the police budget and how they spend, oversee contract negotiations with CPD, and implement mediation programs where appropriate. CPAC will also hold many accountability powers. And as an accountability layer, CPAC will be able to petition for a grand jury investigation into criminal activity by any CPD officer. So it'll be able to hold its own investigations, investigate allegations of misconduct not investigated by COPA. So if COPA declines to investigate an officer, CPAC can. CPAC can also issue subpoenas in those investigations. And at the end of the day, they will have final say on discipline for problematic officers. Finally, this chart here just pretty much reiterates what I just ran through. So on the left-hand side are accountability powers for CPAC. You can see the full list of them. In the middle, you can see where those powers lie. They lie with the mayor and with the police board or with other third parties. And on the right-hand side, you can see with our CPAC ordinance, we are trying to move all of that power to our elected council and have democratic power over police accountability. So now I'm going to pass it back to Tamer, and he's going to introduce our panel for the evening.
Thank you very much, Michael. It is really exciting to have two guests today. We have Jasmine Salas, who's the co-chair of the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. She's also the co-chair of Chicago Boricua Resistance. We also have Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who was the alderman city council who introduced the CPAC ordinance a bunch of years ago when he was a freshman in city council, back when he was the only Democratic Socialist in city council. We're going to jump in right here. We're waiting for Jasmine to jump in as well.
I can't turn my video on. It's not.
Okay.
Oh, here we go.
There we go. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jasmine, let me start with you. What brought you into the fight for CPAC and what does it mean to you?
So I started doing work with CARPER in 2015. I moved to Chicago 2014 from Orlando, Florida, and I was looking for my political home. And one of my friends, Urshel, kept bugging me to table for CPAC. And every week he'd be like, hey, I'm going out to 63rd and Cottage Grove. At the time I lived on campus at UChicago, so I was only 3 blocks away. So one day I'm like, all right, I'll go, let me just calm Marshall down and I'll just go. But I ended up really enjoying not only the conversations that I was having with people, but just learning about CPAC and about the history of policing in Chicago. It was really eye-opening for me, just like having conversations with Black folks on the South Side who had loved ones who were tortured, who, and it's so common. Like I can't tell you how many times someone approached us while we were tabling and said, hey, my brother's in jail for a crime he didn't commit, or my uncle was tased by the cops. These wounds run really deep. And for me, that's what drew me in, just like learning about the history of policing and wanting to join this fight. And so I was elected co-chair of the Alliance in 2018. And since then, I've been serving as co-chair.
That's awesome. Thank you. Alder Rosa, you introduced CPAC in the City Council for the first time in 2016. What made you do that? And what has changed and hasn't changed since then?
Well, I was approached in 2016, and as I was making sure my phone was on, but I was approached in 2016 by Black-led organizations, by individuals that had been directly impacted on a daily, on a weekly, on a monthly basis by police crimes in their community, by police misconduct and abuse. Families that had witnessed the torture of John Burge, activists that had been fighting against police misconduct and brutality for decades. And they said, we have an ordinance. It's called the Civilian Police Accountability Council. And we have been working on this for quite some time to make real the demand of the Black Panthers Party for community control of the police, and finally have democracy when it comes to policing, and ensure that we have civilians that are over the police, that have the power to hire and fire the superintendent, to oversee police misconduct investigations, to set policing policy, and to set the police budget so that we can begin to spend less on racist policing and more on the things that we actually need in our community. And, I'm someone that believes that change comes from the bottom up, and that we need to censor the voices of those that are directly impacted. It's one of the things that I, really learned to embody and follow during my time as an immigrant rights organizer and activist. I myself am a U.S. citizen. I'm not undocumented. And so it was extremely important for me in that fight for immigrant rights to listen to undocumented folks. And so similarly, when it came to the issue of police brutality, we know that racist policing disproportionately targets Black Americans. We know the white supremacist anti-Blackness that runs so deep in this country back to Christopher Columbus. And so it was really important for me to say, well, let me stand with Black-led organizations. This is a movement for liberation. This is a movement of people that are directly impacted by this issue, identifying the solution to this issue and bringing it forward and fighting for this policy change. And as a socialist, I support democracy, right? I want to see hands in the power of the people. I want to shift the balance of power between the capitalist class and the working class. And I think, we all understand and recognize the way in which the police have been used to keep poor people down, whether it be criminalizing the act of being poor, whether it be criminalizing the act of trying to survive. We know that the police are a tool of oppressing working people, and primarily Black, poor, and working people. And so for all those reasons, I felt that I had a responsibility to stand with the Chicago Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression, to stand with the coalition that was fighting for CPAC now, and introduce this ordinance when they were unable to find any other aldermen at that point in time to introduce it for them.
Thank you. Jasmine, let's go back to you. The alderman just talked about a little bit about the budget. And a lot of people now are talking about defunding the police. They're talking about abolition. And those are two concepts that are new to some people, but familiar to others. How do those concepts interact with CPAC? And why do you think it's important that we have community control of the police, even if we want to do those things like defunding and abolition?
Sure, yeah. So we have folks in our organization who want to abolish the police. We have members who are very clear about that, but they're at the table for CPAC. And for us as well, we know that CPAC is not the end all be all. We know that after we pass CPAC, there's still going to be work to do. And so for us, we view CPAC as a way to stop the horrendous amount of crime and brutality that's occurring currently, as a way to stop what's happening right now. And so we're very intentional about that. And we know, especially for Black folks, we've been oppressed by the police, and policing makes it hard for us to even organize around anything else, right? Because we are constantly facing political repression. You know, the war on drugs, for example, has criminalized Black and brown people and forced us into prison. And so we know that policing is something that is definitely impacting Black folks and brown folks as well. And so CPAC is a way to stop what's happening right now. And I think things like CPAC would truly transform our conversations about defunding CPD and getting rid of policing overall. You know, once we have the power to do so, then we don't have to talk about things in the abstract. We can talk about them in the concrete.
Yeah, that makes sense, because this morning there was an action in front of City Hall, and that's one of the things Frank Chapman, who you all saw in the video in the beginning, and who was the field organizer for Carper, and who was a mentor to so many people, he said, "I don't trust them to defund. I trust us to defund." And that's why it's so important to have that control, so that when we do things like defunding, we know what we're taking away, and we're giving them the rules and regulations that they have to run by. Alder Rosa, what do you think about defunding and abolition, and how they intersect with CPAC? You're muted.
There we go. I was muted by the host. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. What do you think about defunding and abolition, and how they intersect with CPAC?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a socialist, and so I'm an abolitionist. I know that we can create a world where people actually have the things that they need to survive, where we don't criminalize poverty. When people are having a mental health crisis, that they will have the support that they need. I think that if we create the fabric of society where we take care of one another as human beings, we have a trauma-informed approach where we seek to undo all of the oppression that so many of us have faced in so many different ways of our lives, that we can have a world where we don't have policing the way that we have it now. So I believe strongly that a step towards abolition, a step towards, that world where we are all truly free, begins with the process of defunding the police. In the city of Chicago, 40% of our corporate fund goes towards policing. 40 cents of every dollar that we spend goes towards policing, and yet we aren't any safer. Only 17% of murders in the city of Chicago are solved by the Chicago Police Department. Nationally, serial arsonists, only 20% of serial arsonists are caught. And so the reality is that I think oftentimes we imagine that there's these scenarios where the police officers are going to be heroes, that when we need them, they're going to come into our home. But really what we mostly find is that police officers are pulling people over, criminalizing them for minor offenses, escalating those minor interactions to deadly situations. One in every 1,000 Black men in the United States will be murdered by the police. We see it happen in Wendy's parking lots. We saw it happen with Laquan McDonald, a young man that was in a mental health crisis and needed the support of health professionals, instead shot 16 times. So I think that it's very clear from all of the research, from all of the evidence, that our current system of policing doesn't work. And there's such a, there's so much research now, both from lived experience, but also from folks that have looked at what is the most effective way to spend our public safety dollars. And what they have found is that if you invest in jobs, education, mental health services, after-school programs, job programs, that is the best way to make our community safe. So I am for defunding the Chicago Police Department. I think we need to begin that process by getting police out of our Chicago public schools. I introduced that ordinance today. I'm very proud to say that all 6 members of the Democratic Socialists of America that serve in the Chicago City Council are co-sponsors and leaders on that measure. And I'm proud to say that all 6 members of the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America that are members of the Chicago City Council are leaders on pushing for the Civilian Police Accountability Council. I think that these are 2 critical first steps that we need to vigorously push for in the next 30, 60 days to make sure that we get them over the finish line, and we can then continue to build upon these victories to work towards defunding the Chicago Police Department and ultimately abolishing the police in favor of systems of public safety where we take care of each other instead of locking each other up.
Jasmine, the mayor announced, I think on Monday, announced the use of force working group, which includes people from the coalitions who support CPAC, as well as other people from organizations like BLM Chicago, the Chicago Torture Center, SOUL, Southsiders for Unity and Liberation. How do you view the development of this announcement by the mayor? Do you think, I'll tell you what I think, and then you can tell me. I think it seems like they're feeling the pressure and they're trying to do something to release some of that pressure and let some of it vent so that we stop asking for community control of the police. That's what it seems like to me, but I want to get both of your opinions on it, and we're going to start with you, Jasmine.
I mean, you're not that far off, Tamer. I think it's just more smoke and more mirrors to make it seem like Lori Lightfoot is taking action on this issue. You know, we've been hearing from members of the city council that their offices are being flooded with people calling them about CPAC. I'm sure Alderman Rosa has been getting these calls as well. I know Alderman Vasquez, for example, put out a statement that he got 10,000 emails about CPAC. So we know that Lightfoot is also getting these calls. You know, we've been telling people, call your alderman and call Lori Lightfoot. Tell them that you want CPAC. And so she's fully aware of CPAC. You know, she has referred to our movement as the fringe left in conversations that she's had about CPAC. She's fully aware. And I think if she were truly as progressive as she likes to claim to be, she would take action around CPAC. You know, I think what they're doing with this task force is very similar to what they always do. They always form task forces. They always have movement people, activists, organizers on them to take them out of the work that they're doing to actually build a powerful movement. And I feel like that's exactly what's going on here. I know when the murder of or lynching of Laquan McDonald came to light in 2015, they also formed, you know, a freaking task force, you know? So this is very much, you know, part of their tricks. You know, they know that if they can put something together that makes them look good, if they can de-organize people and kind of steer them in another direction, you know, that's going to slow down our movement for CPAC. And so for us as organizers for CPAC, we have to be very clear about that if you want CPAC, you have to take action, right? You can't rely on a task force.
So Alder Rosa, how do you deal with something like that where, you know, the city or the mayor are trying to sort of co-opt movements, trying to change the direction of them, and trying to get people to stop taking to the streets every day or every week, demanding community control of the police? How do you fight against that? And how do you win that political battle and make sure that you can make it happen in city council and even get it past the mayor who is insistent on not having it?
Yeah. Well, there is no doubt that we are living in a movement moment, that we are at a point in time where people that may not necessarily have been organized, that may have not necessarily come in contact with organizations, feel the need to come out and demand justice, to say Black Lives Matter, to say Black trans lives matter. And we have to be able to translate that people power into substantive victory because our people need justice, right? And so I think that one of the things that is extremely important is that we need organization. And so we're very lucky to have the Chicago Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression. We're very lucky to have the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America. We're very lucky to have organizations that bring together activists and organizers to continue providing that energy, to continue to provide a path for us to actually translate the hundreds of thousands of people that have taken to the streets in the city of Chicago over the last several weeks into substantive victories for working class people. I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that, you know, this mayor ran on a platform of quote unquote bringing in the light. She said that she was going to bring in good government, that she was going to do away with the authoritarian approaches of previous mayors like Mayor Rahm Emanuel, that she was going to make sure that we had transparency and inclusivity in government. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that she's continued the same failed neoliberal approach to governance as Mayor Rahm Emanuel. There's a reason why she campaigned on getting rid of the TIF for Lincoln Yards, billions of dollars to a developer who was connected to Rahm Emanuel's office. And that's that some of her biggest campaign donors have a financial interest in that project moving forward. So while she said she was going to cancel that on the campaign trail, now that she's mayor, she's backtracked on that. Similarly, on issue after issue after issue, she said that she was going to support just cause for eviction. She said that in a major speech in February of this year. And then she came back and said, oh, no, actually, I didn't mean that. I'm just really going to extend the amount of time the tenants have before they can be forced out of their homes by big landlords and big property management companies. So that also is deeply tied into who she's getting her money from, big landlords, realtors. So we know that, unfortunately, in the status quo, our government is for sale. And we know that deep pockets and, their allies in city council and in the fifth floor of City Hall are going to carry water for them. But I think it's important to point out the hypocrisy. I think it's important to continue to raise our demands. There are a number of issues in this city that we're able to move forward without the support of the mayor. We saw that with, raising the minimum wage under Mayor Rahm Emanuel. He was not for that. He fought that tooth and nail, but it became such a large issue that in the lead up to his reelection campaign in 2015, he knew he had to get it done. Similarly, with the O'Hare Airport minimum wage ordinance, that was something that the mayor opposed. But SEIU fought, they canvassed, they knocked on doors, they targeted specific aldermen that were not firm and not clear on that issue, and they were able to get together 26 votes to the point that the mayor, then Mayor Rahm Emanuel, actually had to backtrack and say, you know what, actually I do support this, because he wanted to avoid the embarrassment of aldermen passing something beyond over his objection. So I think similarly, we need to continue to bring that people power to bear. We have to continue to be out on the street. We need to continue to engage in direct action. That is critically important, because that is what really fuels our moment. But at the same time, we have to have the organization. We have to have the strategy that brings us together and coalesces us so that we really understand who do we need to target to get to 26, who do we need to lobby, who do we need to speak with. And once we get that 26, how do we continue to push those 26 aldermen to make sure that they are clear, that people are demanding the Civilian Police Accountability Council. This is the compromise in this moment. And if they want to really fulfill their roles as elected officials, they need to be listening to the people out in the street.
It's really great having the both of you, because it's kind of like we have the leaders in city council and the leaders on the street, and neither of them can work without the other. We have to sustain the movement outside, and we have to make sure that our elected officials are pushing forward. One of the important, and I've gotten a lot of questions about this, one of the important qualifications for being a member of the Civilian Police Accountability Council is that you cannot have been a law enforcement officer or a state's attorney's office employee. Some people think that that's unfair, that these are people who are also part of the community. Why should they not be able to be elected to CPAC? Jasmine, what do you say to that, and why is it important to make sure that former law enforcement officers, or current, obviously, law enforcement officers and state's attorney's office employees are not part of CPAC?
It's a conflict of interest. I feel like we have to make sure, if we're going to pass CPAC and actually have community control of the police, we have to do it right, And I think if we allow cops whose interests align with fellow cops, even if you are a former cop, to serve on the CPAC, then we're just going to continue this racist system, And so honestly, being a cop is not it's a choice, right? I can't take my skin color off. But if somebody is a cop, you can take off your badge. You cannot be a cop. And I feel like we need to be clear that, if you choose to serve as a police officer, then you choose to work in the interest of the capitalist class and of policing overall. And so that's why, for folks who want to serve on the CPAC, I think it's good to have people who aren't cops, of course. And actually, some of the qualifications for serving on the CPAC is that you have to have 2 years civil rights experience, and you have to have some basic understanding of how policing works. And I feel like that's the way that we have to approach this work. to make sure that the FOP, because make no mistake, when we pass CPAC, the FOP is going to do everything that they can to make sure that CPAC doesn't work. They're going to do everything that they can to make sure that they can maintain as much power as possible. So that's why we have to limit who can serve on this CPAC.
Alder Rosa, Jasmine brought up the FOP. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of power that you see FOP wields, whether it's in city council or even outside, and what kind of obstacles do they create for true accountability in policing in Chicago?
Well, you know, it's very well documented in research across the U.S. that police unions exert an extraordinary amount of power in the chambers of power. You know, they often push for laws that further criminalize individuals. In the state of Illinois, they have pushed for measures that really limit the city of Chicago's ability to deal with the substance and the matters that actually go into the union contract. You know, the FOP traditionally has endorsed aldermen that they view favorable to their, you know, stated goals, and they've opposed aldermen that have not been on their side. You know, we have a new president of the Fraternal Order of Police, which I don't have to go into. I'm sure many of you are very well aware of the many controversies that he has been involved in. But what I will say is that, you know, he has now pledged that he is going to, you know, use his friends in labor to go after progressive and socialist aldermen such as myself. But I think that we have to understand that, you know, we have to outweigh that power with people power. And as Jasmine noted, I have gotten over 10,000 emails. My colleague, Andre Vasquez, so many of my other colleagues have gotten so much communication from the public saying the time is now to defund CPD, the time is now for CPAC now. And we also know that hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets. So quite frankly, you know, I'm not very afraid by the FOP's threat, but unfortunately, over the last several decades, they've had an extraordinary amount of success changing the laws down in Springfield so that it becomes extremely difficult for the city of Chicago to be able to move on substantive measures. Now, one of the solutions to this problem may actually, in fact, be disbanding the police. Because if we disbanded the police and reconstitute a public safety agency that is really geared towards ensuring that we are providing public safety in our streets, then we do away with the problem that the FOP has presented to meaningful police reform.
Do you think that there's a lot of calls right now for organized labor to cut their relationship with the FOP and other police unions? Do you think that that should be the case? I'll start with Alder Rose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's been a lot of research that has gone into the fact that the Fraternal Order of Police does not function like a traditional union that represents the interests of working class people. You know, I think that it's very clear from the genesis of policing in the South. Policing came out of slave patrols that were used to terrorize Black people, both during slavery and after emancipation. We know that in the North, policing came out of you know, private security firms that were used to protect the rich and powerful, to put down strikes, to harass working people. And so unions exist to organize working people to demand better conditions in the workplace. Unfortunately, in the context of the Fraternal Order of Police, in fact, we have seen that this union has actually propped up the interests of the rich and powerful against the working poor. They've terrorized Black people. They've terrorized working poor communities. And so for that reason, I think that we need to understand that in this context, police unions are not the unions that socialists traditionally support. And for that reason, I absolutely agree with so many of others in the labor movement that have said that it's time to cut those ties. We need unions to stand up for working people. We don't need unions to stand up for racist policing and for the interests of the rich and powerful.
Jasmine, anything you want to add to that about our friends at the FOP?
Well, they're not my friend. I'll say definitely, you know, cops in my mind aren't workers. You know, cops are meant to actually police workers. You know, just looking at the role that policing has played in breaking up labor strikes, you know, and beating people up and attacking people as they're picketing for their rights. That in my mind means you're not with the working class people in the city. And let's be clear, working class people are Black and brown too. So if you are a police officer, who is policing us, who is harassing us, then you're not with us and you're not a part of our class.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm muting myself on and off because my dog, of course, decided to bark right now. Alder Rosa, I have a final question for both of you. I'm going to start with you, Alder Rosa. There are so many people who are right now moved by this moment who maybe have not been involved before. And specifically, what advice do you have for white people who want to join this fight and who know that police brutality is a burden that is largely carried by Black and brown folks? How should they approach this work?
Well, I think they have to understand that in the United States, I believe that we have what many call racial capitalism. That you cannot divorce capitalism from white supremacy, particularly in the context of this continent. And so when you look at the history of colonization, when you look at the history of slavery, when you look at the development of capitalism, particularly in this hemisphere, what you find is that so much of it is built on anti-Black. And so we have to be serious about addressing anti-Blackness, whether it be in the white community, whether it be in the Latinx community. We have to understand that it permeates everything, our interactions, that it permeates our institutions. And so if we want to be serious about defeating capitalism, then we need to be serious about defeating oppression in all its forms, and then tackling white supremacy. I'm a queer man, and that I have to understand that I too can carry internalized homophobia, that I too can, in my own way, support heteropatriarchy and other oppressive forms, other oppressive systems. So, one of the most important things that I've come to learn in my time as an activist is an approach to organizing that was really developed by women of color and women of color feminism. And what they say is that, oppression is like a birdcage. And if you think of a birdcage, it has very thin little metal strands, right? And so perhaps if you are a wealthy, gay white man, able-bodied, right, you might just see one little, strand, right? And you just say, oh, if only we could overcome homophobia, I could get right past that little metal bar that's keeping me back, right? We have to understand that, if you begin to understand things through an intersectional lens, right, and you begin to see how all those oppressions intersect, then you begin to see the cage of oppression, right? If you understand that, none of us are free until all of us are free, that until we dismantle all of these oppressive systems, none of us can truly be free human beings, that we're going to continue to see exploitation, that we're going to continue to see people pitted against one another in favor of the interests of the capitalist class, the ultra wealthy. So, my hope is that, folks that are entering this fight understand that we cannot be class reductionists, that we really have to understand the role of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in our movement and our society, that we have to confront that. And until we begin the serious work of confronting that, both within our own organization, both within ourselves, that we will never truly have a movement for liberation and emancipation in this society.
Jasmine, I'll let you have the last word, and I'll pose the same question to you. What kind of advice do you have for white people who want to join this movement and make a difference?
So I have two pieces and they're connected. One, show up, and two, listen to Black people. Show up and listen to Black people. Because, for example, the Alliance is a Black-led organization, but we are multiracial. We have members who are Arab American, we have members who are Black, of course, we have members who are Latinx, Afro-Latinx, like myself. We have members, and white members, of course. We have members from different racial backgrounds because we know that we need to unite all, So showing up is a key part of that, and we have to be clear to actually show up and do the work that is being asked of us. It's not enough to show up, to go to a rally, take a picture, drop a hashtag Black Lives Matter and think, okay, that's it, I'm done. I did my part. You have to show up and you have to be ready to do work. Anti-racism work is real work. And it requires us to not only challenge ourselves internally, but also change the world around us externally. So that means having hard conversations with family members and not just waiting until Thanksgiving to do so, to constantly be having these conversations. If you're white, Talk to your white friends about policing. Talk to your white friends about anti-Blackness, you know, and begin to have those conversations. And then also showing up and doing the work. That means canvassing, that means tabling, that means door knocking in your community, and actually contribute to this movement in a way that will help us all build power.
Well, this has been wonderful. Any last words from either of you? I'm all ears. Okay.
Call your alderman. Call your alderman if you support CPAC, and tell them to support CPAC as well.
Excellent.
You know, we are in a very critical moment, and we need everybody to call their alderman. Alderman Rosa is my alderman, so I will just tell you, Alderman Rosa, please support CPAC. But no, seriously, like call folks, get on the phone. Tell your friends to also get on the phone. I know people have anxiety around calling people. Tweet at people, email people, you know, get in everybody's face about CPAC, because we are in such a critical moment. You know, I remember when I first started doing work with Carper in 2015, you know, it was another similar moment that we had a lot of momentum. We were gaining support left and right. You know, we had organizations who were endorsing the campaign for CPAC. And I see 2020 as a similar moment, but a bigger moment. And so I feel like now is the opportunity. If we're going to pass CPAC, we need to get on it, and we need to take concrete action to make sure that actually happens.
Thank you so much. That's a perfect segue. So first, I want to thank you both so much for being here. The work you're doing is amazing. We stand with you. We will show up. And this is a great segue into throwing it to Megan, because she will now tell people who are watching a little bit more about how they can get involved, call their alderpersons, the mayor, and so on. And we're having this kind of ward by ward strategy that we're trying to implement. So thank you both so much. It was a real pleasure talking to you. And now I will throw it to Megan.
Great. Thanks so much, Tamer. So my name is Megan, and I'm also with the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America. You know, we've talked about a lot tonight, both about CPAC and about the broader set of transformational changes that we as socialists and anti-racists call for. And we want to make sure that before we go, we connect this wide-ranging discussion to some concrete next steps for winning CPAC. So in the chat, you'll find a link to a Google document with links to all the steps suggested in this slide. This slide is actually just like a screenshot of that document. We'll also post a link to that Google document in the Facebook page for this event in case you need to find it again after the call. So first, in many wards of the city, we know that organizers and activists from this huge coalition of organizations backing CPAC are already working to put pressure on alder folks to get them to vote yes on that ordinance. In order to support that ward by ward organizing, we are asking you to fill out the form linked in that Google document with your information, so that we can connect you with organizers in your ward. And if you're part of an organization or even really just a group of neighbors that's already working to push your alderperson on CPAC, please just shoot us an email at winningcpac@gmail with details so that we can work to connect others in your ward to your work. Yeah, so second, to echo Jasmine, we want to really ask folks to call both their alderperson and the mayor about CPAC. In the Google document, you'll find a link to a call guide that will help you identify your alderperson if you don't know who they are. It will tell you whether your alderperson already supports CPAC. And the call guide will also give you guidance on what to say in a phone call to your alderperson, depending on where they currently are on the CPAC ordinance. Third, finally, and really importantly, please consider following, supporting, and joining the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, Black Lives Matter Chicago, Chicago DSA, and lots of other coalition organizations in order to hear about upcoming actions. In closing, we want to extend gratitude to Carlos Ramirez Rosa of the 35th Ward and to Jasmine Salas of Carper for being here tonight to educate us. We also just want to extend gratitude to all of you for being here to educate yourself and to figure out how to get involved. And we want to express love and solidarity to the protesters in the streets across the country right now, fighting for an end to the murder of Black and brown folks at the hands of the police, and indeed for an end to policing as we know it. I know many of us were in the streets this morning calling for CPAC, and we're going to stay there until we see our demands met. With that, we'll just say that we here at CDSA are honored to have all of you as comrades in this fight, and we look forward to organizing with you soon. Good night to everyone.